When substances need to be driven against their concentration gradient from low to high concentrations, active transport is required. This process uses energy to move a substance across the membrane using selective protein carriers. The sodium-potassium pump is a specialized membrane protein carrier, common in most animal cells, that moves sodium and potassium ions across the plasma membrane. ATP fuels the pump in the movement of these ions from low to high concentrations, moving sodium ions outside of the cell where they become concentrated and bringing potassium ions into the cell where their concentration is higher relative to the outside. In other instances of active transport, the concentration gradient created from the action of one pump can be used as the input of energy to drive a different pump, a process known as coupled transport. The large concentration gradient of sodium ions is used to bring glucose into the cell against its concentration gradient.
The sodium-potassium exchange pump is an example of an active transport process. Active transport processes can move substances against a concentration gradient, and they require energy expenditure in the form of the breakdown of ATP. The sodium-potassium exchange pump moves sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions into the cell. The carrier protein for sodium-potassium exchange is embedded in the cell membrane. 3 sodium ions and an ATP molecule can bind to the carrier protein on the inside of the cell membrane. The ATP is broken down to ADP and phosphate. Simultaneously, the carrier protein changes shape and the sodium ions are transported across the membrane and released on the outside. In its new conformation, the carrier protein can now bind potassium ions on the outside of the cell. 2 potassium ions move into the carrier protein from the outside of the cell membrane, and the phosphate attached to the carrier protein is released. The carrier protein changes shape again, reverting to its original conformation and delivering the potassium ions across the membrane to the inside of the cell. It is now ready to repeat the process of sodium-potassium exchange.